security researcher comes to you, so you get an email in your inbox, somebody's monitoring that security at email address. But again, it may come through one of your customer service sites. Even if you do have that security address, it may come through some unusual mechanism. It may be that the disclosure comes via some blog post to a certain extent, but let's say that it's come in via email. So at that point, the clock starts ticking. And again, because this again is a sort of evolving situation, we talked about the length of time that it might take to fix a hardware vulnerability. Some fixes are very, very quick, but there's this sort of open debate on how long these things should take. If you look at the ISO vulnerability disclosure specification that addresses this, it doesn't really talk about time. It talks about time in one place where it says that you must respond to a researcher within 7 days. We also say that in other places. Generally though, if you can get a response as quickly as possible, that is going to get you in the researcher's good books. And so when vendors respond within 2 hours, researchers are extremely happy. So again, this is a sort of mental game as well with the security researcher. If you're showing that you're responsive, that's a very good opening statement, and it's a very good relationship establishment with the researcher. But anything really between 24 and 48 hours would be good. And so all you're doing at that point is acknowledging the report and saying, thank you very much for disclosing this to us. You, depending on what's included in the original report, you may seek to, at that point, ask for more information. And that's, more information is always good. You may also seek what's called a POC, or a proof of concept. Now, the usefulness of that is that it enables you to potentially repeat, or your engineers to repeat that vulnerability more quickly than if you just got a piece of paper that tells you about this thing, and time is on your side, time needs to be on your side. So requesting a proof of concept is always a good thing. They can only say no, or that it's not easy to repeat, or you need specialist equipment or whatever. But any way that you can make your life easier is good. So engaging the researcher in that conversation early is a very, very good thing. What you're expecting is a disclosure. Now, again, the de facto standard is 90 days. That's what we talk about in the ETSI specification. It's very strange because it's evolved over time. Some people believe that 30 days is completely adequate for certain types of bug and issue. Others believe 90 days, others believe more. This is also potentially a bone of contention with the security researcher. So if you publish your policy and you say, we have a 90-day disclosure policy, but the researcher expects a shorter timeline, then you need to address that situation very early, because partly it's standing your ground. You set the policy, you're the company. That's what they should abide by, but it's not that black and white. It is a two-way street. If it's a very simple fix, then you should be looking at fixing that as soon as possible. You shouldn't be looking at extending the entire 90-day period when you don't really need that. But at the same time, the security researcher may not understand how complex the product is, or your relationship to your partners. If it's a company that you're working with that needs to fix it, then it is going to take longer. But your friend here is transparency. Be open about that. Explain that situation to them. Explain that you want to help them, and here's the situation. If the security researcher is being unreasonable, you also have the ability to make that clear in any public material. Now, it may backfire on you. You have to be very, very careful about that. But the security research community is pretty hard on researchers that don't act in good faith. And if a company is being essentially blackmailed, then that is not a good situation to be in. And you know, I think it would be perfectly reasonable for the company to consider outing bad practice if they felt that they were really being treated in an unethical way. But you have to be careful about how you do that. Now, our aim here is to get to the end of that agreed timeline successfully, and for the researcher to be able to write up their findings in whatever way. So it might be that they write a blog post, or that they write that there's an academic paper that's published at a conference or a presentation at a hacking conference. And for you at that point to both be satisfied and say, yes, we have deployed the fixes to the consumer, and the products are safe. That's the key aim here, is protecting consumers. And you may want to say, and this fix was available on this date. So then it's coordinated. That's the whole point of this, coordinated vulnerability disclosure. At the end of that process, the researcher gets what they want, they get the publicity, but it looks really, really good on the company as well, or group of companies in some cases. And you know, it's a good news story. And as I say, you know, actually your aim as a company is for that not to hit the press, or for it to hit the press in a very benign way, because it's a boring story. Boring is good in this case. As I mentioned earlier, you know, considering that the security researchers' circumstances are very different to yours, I mentioned about neurodiversity, but think about what motivates that research and what are they in it for. Some of the security researchers I've worked with, and you can see from their past history, they court fame, and they will speak to every single journalist they possibly can. And so their motivation is ego. Now, you as a company can play off that as well. And you've got to learn the motivations of that security researcher and use them to best effect in an ethical manner, of course. But understand what drives that person. Is it again the need to do good, that they feel that your consumers are going to be harmed by this? Again, you know, you can work with that, but also understand the bad motivations as well. If people are trying to extort you for money, or if they're lying to you, if you know, you have to understand those negative aspects. And again, as I said before, treat them all the way through the process. Treat them humanely. Treat them in a fair manner, and be nice to them. It may seem silly to say that, but it can get very fraught. And it just, the only advice I can give you on this is just keep cool, avoid conflict as much as possible, and try, you know, ultimately the aim at the end of this is for it to not go badly. So if you need to take a step back and think about it, then please do, but try to ensure that there's a positive communication with that researcher. Do not resort to legal threats. This is unbelievable, but it happens all the time that companies, their first response is to threaten the researcher or to call the police in some cases. And at least in places like the UK now, when the police get calls about this, the cybercrime units, they actually now respond to the companies and say, no, this is a responsible disclosure. This is, you know, this is perfectly acceptable. And there's been some good examples of that. In the UK, York City Council, there's a very public situation there, where the security researcher was backed by the police. And again, I think this is a really good example of how mature this is now, that this as a topic is really starting to become well understood. So you continue to work with the researcher, and you need to assess that vulnerability and understand it in more detail. Now, you know, what is the issue? Is it purely what the researcher is saying, or are there other issues? So when you start to look at it, you might start to uncover other issues that the security researcher doesn't know about. Now, you can choose to disclose that to the security researcher and say, look, we've got a much bigger issue here, and there's the X, Y, and Z. You may choose not to, of course, that's your right. But again, transparency is good. I would be in favour of having a very open communication with the researcher and say that, yeah, we've found these other issues as well, and how you're going to address them. I don't see that there are many downsides to that, other than that if the other issues are on a longer timeline, that may create issues for the security researcher in terms of going public with their work. And again, you may want to make an agreement with the researcher that they don't disclose those other elements of it. That's an assessment that you need to make. You need to understand where those issues are. If they're not in a library that you can control, can you perhaps mitigate that? If you can put in place monitoring, for example, extra systems monitoring, or can you put in new code in your software that can account for that vulnerability, that can essentially mitigate that in a different way? So you don't necessarily need to throw your hands up and say, oh, well, this isn't an open source library, it's nothing to do with us, or this isn't a third-party piece of equipment that we can't deal with. Please do tell the researcher that that is another company or whatever. That's still useful information. But think outside the box. Think about how you could address the vulnerability in other ways. Think also that when this goes public, that other people may want to look at your product and may uncover those vulnerabilities. So there's a very famous vulnerability in Android a few years ago called stage fright. And this was in a media library, and that was designed to be optimized. So it actually had a lot of the security checks removed because media rendering requires super fast processing. So there were a ton of vulnerabilities over there that are called integer overflows. Now, these were looked over and looked over and looked over, and there ended up being 4 or 5 different patches by Google to address this one vulnerability. So in those types of situations, you may see further research against your product. So when you're looking at the vulnerability, do consider that this is not on its own and that there may be further research takes place on this. So putting in place simple patches that maybe avoid the security researcher, or just literally stop the proof of concept that they send you, is not going to be adequate. You really need to look at properly fixing the issue and seeking help where you need it as well. So you fixed the product, you've started to deploy patches, hopefully through software. You've maybe even completed that process within the 90 days. You've agreed with the security researcher when you go in public. You may even decide to write your own security advisory as well. The whole point about this is being coordinated. So what I would advise companies to do is perhaps share the security advisory or part of the security advisory with the researcher, or even ask the researcher to write part of it with you. Again, they can only say no. They're probably going to want to have the independence of writing their own material, but that's okay. What you really want them to be saying is that that you worked with them well and that the consumer is safe. That's really the outcome that you want. You don't necessarily need to worry too much about what they put in there. Of course, they're going to talk about some of the technical details. Of course, they're going to put that on the website, and that will be public. You don't need to be embarrassed about that. They could have done that without you being there anyway. So don't worry about that at all. And aim for agreeing that date that the coordinated disclosure goes public, and perhaps even work with the journalists yourselves together with the researcher if necessary. Again, take each situation on its merits. You need to understand, again, what the motivations of that researcher are. Perhaps also I would advise informing your customers as well at the same time, and giving them as much information as possible, because again, people don't like surprises, um, but people do like you to be honest and transparent. So, last but certainly not least on this section, to credit the researcher. So we mentioned that earlier, but there are a number of ways you could do that. Certainly, I would advise mentioning it in any public-facing PR. And you can see, again, this is just one example of a company, Deutsche Telekom, where they have their Hall of Fame or their acknowledgement page. This is for free and it generates a lot of goodwill. And it shows that you are a company that is modern and understands security research. And that will put you in a positive light with the hacking community. So, I can talk through a couple of example disclosures to you now. I'll give you a couple of recent examples. There was an issue that came about at this summer's hacking conferences, and also at Usenix, which is an academic security conference that you see a lot of papers at in this area. And there was an issue called Revolti. This was an issue that was related to 4G network, and that issue was submitted to the GSMA's global industry CVD scheme. So these are kind of interesting schemes that look at issues that affect the entirety of an industry, and GSMA is quite pioneering in this. Where those issues, they did affect individual products, but actually it was an issue with the core standards, and it affected multiple parties. So that issue was disclosed to GSMA last year in around about November time, I believe. And work has been going on together with the security researchers right across industry to patch those devices, to fix the standards themselves, and to make sure that they're tested and that the networks are not vulnerable. So a huge exercise. Had that scheme not been in place at industry level, those parties would not be able to communicate with each other very easily. And what would have probably happen is that the security researchers would say, this is a global problem, and all of these different vendors are affected, and all of these different network operators are affected, and it's a nightmare. And then they would have been at the starting point maybe a year behind. That didn't happen. What happened was, 9 months later, the security researchers from University of Bochum and other places gave their presentation at Usenix and were able to say that the networks were patched and that the vendors had fixed their issues. And then the mobile network operators were also able to say, in some cases, our network was not vulnerable because this issue was fixed. That is a win-win for everybody. Fantastic security research by those university researchers, a big, huge effort across industry to fix it, from vendors, from mobile network operators, from standards bodies, and all done without it being public until the right time. That is the example that I would like to hold up right now. This is very recent, of very good CVD. That's how it should work. And there are many, many other examples. Just while I'm on this topic, there are other schemes like that exist or are coming into existence. So there's something called vulnerable things, which will be targeted specifically at smaller companies who would like to do disclosures and who might not be able to get off the ground very easily or need some help, but would also like to work with their peers. That's coming along very soon and might be useful to you. And there are also other schemes for proxy disclosure that exist as well. You might have heard of HackerOne and BugCrowd. There are a number of different types of those companies as well. A couple of examples for you as well from recent ones. So Avast did some research on set-top boxes recently and found very common vulnerabilities. A lot of the issues that were caused a few years ago on things like Open Telnet, which is a very archaic old protocol, are seen embedded within some of these IoT products, and they're very easy to fix, but they're very, very common and often create a lot of media because these flaws should not exist. So Avast found some issues in certain types of set-top boxes, and they disclosed those to those companies, and those have been reported recently. Another example is a very serious one, which is that the entirety of the internet stack in a particular library called Trek, which is used in a lot of different products, and they call the vulnerabilities the Ripple 20. It has some very serious issues in it, and it covers a lot of products. And where you've got these, again, class attacks where everybody uses the same libraries, everybody uses the same stacks for providing internet or providing encryption, that is a big problem because they can come out of nowhere. You may not get it reported to you. You may see it in the media about this other company that provides that stack. So again, this demonstrates the importance of you perhaps needing to build relationships with those people, or even in some cases actually forking the open source stack themselves and being able to patch more quickly. That's what Amazon do with OpenSSL. They actually run their own fork of OpenSSL so they can patch it quickly. Other examples include issues with Microsoft Azure Sphere, which is a product which is used for IoT. Cloud products perhaps seen more easy to patch, but again, if you're using stuff that other people are using, you're therefore impacted by any issues that potentially happen with that product. The recent one with the Centurion product, which used to be Gemalto, IBM X-Force Red disclosed vulnerabilities against that, and those products are included in things like insulin pumps and industrial systems and so on. So what we're starting to see now is certainly a lot of these, the internals of these products and these big commercial platforms being looked at very seriously. But all of these things were done under vulnerability disclosure. So that means that those products have been patched and that the issues have been disclosed to those companies. The reason that a lot of the successful vulnerability disclosures are not public is testament to the fact that, again, the media doesn't necessarily like a good news story, but that was successful and that it wasn't an issue. It's only when it becomes an issue that it becomes very noisy in the press. So success is marked by silence in a lot of cases.